and welcome to a special edition of Represent NYC. I'm Dr. Christina Greer. Tonight, we're going to examine the future viability of Donald Trump's presidency. Will it survive the legal scrutiny of the Robert Mueller investigation? The ongoing special counsel investigation has loomed over Donald Trump's presidency since his first year in office, and as Trump begins his third year in office, the pressure is escalating at a significant rate. Most recently, Trump's lawyer, Michael Cohen, has agreed to testify before the House Oversight and Reform Committee in February. 2 months ago, he pled guilty in federal court for lying to Congress. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison and has spent considerable time with federal prosecutors and Mueller. It's also been reported that this month, that convicted campaign chairman and Trump fixer, Paul Manafort, shared polling data with a Russian official linked to their intelligence service during the course of the 2016 campaign. Trump, of course, denies knowledge of all of it. Okay, so what does all of this mean? And what does it mean for Trump's presidency? Are these legal breadcrumbs leading to impeachment? Let's discuss. Joining me now are political strategist Lincoln Mitchell, New York Times political reporter Jeff Mays, and Democratic pollster and communications strategist Matt McDermott. Thank you all for being here with me. Okay, so Lincoln, I'm going to start with you.
Yes.
Former campaign chairman Paul Manafort, convicted. Former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, pled guilty. Former lawyer Michael Cohen, pled guilty, going to jail. What does this really mean? And does this get us any closer to impeachment or some sort of understanding of how Russia played a role in the 2016 election?
It certainly gets us closer to understanding what happened in the 2016 election. The Mueller investigation and the report that will come out of that and at some point will become public will be an extremely important historical document to understand what happened. The impact it has on politics will be very different. The impeachment process is not a legal process, it's a political process. And the only question that matters there are to get the 2/3 to vote to convict in the U.S. Senate, you need 20 Republicans. And until you can have 20 Republicans voting that way, there's zero chance of impeachment. And to get those 20 Republicans voting that way, you're going to need Trump's popularity to be so low that he's vulnerable in Republican primaries. Right now, as long as Trump hovers around 30%, any Republican who votes to impeach him, particularly if you're in a solidly red state, could lose a primary to a pro-Trump candidate. So the politics of this are not going to lead to impeachment.
And just as a reminder for our viewers at home, it's the House that sort of votes on impeachment,
majority,
and it's the Senate that votes on conviction.
With a need of 2/3.
Exactly.
And that's the key.
Okay, so Jeff, do you agree with Lincoln's analysis?
Yeah,
or?
but I think an important point is what comes out of that Mueller report. So there's going to be a battle, right, of how much of that is public, how much of that is made public. Once the report is released, like, what is Mr. Mueller going to do? Is he going to go out and discuss his findings? And I think that could play a huge role in whether Mr. Trump's popularity dips low enough. You know, if Mr. Mueller found, like, deep disloyalty to the United States in there, that could really hurt any sort of approval for President Trump. And now you have Michael Cohen, his lawyer, who's going to testify before Congress. So he was untruthful about many things, federal prosecutors said. So we still don't know what he's going to say. I mean, he may get up before Congress and say things that we have yet to hear.
What do you think, man?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the question for me is really twofold, is should and can the president be impeached is, I think, one question. I think the other most important question is, can the House and should the House vote on impeachment? And I think those are very different questions. And I think there's a political piece of that and a historical piece of that. And I think the question facing Democrats, particularly in the House, is can they move past 2020, given what we know and given what we're soon to know out of the Mueller report, and not hold an impeachment vote in the House? Doesn't mean the president's going to be impeached by any stretch, but that vote, I think, is an important symbol to the American people that Democrats care about the precedents here and care about making history and making it clear to the American people what has happened is not okay.
So it's fascinating, though, because the Democrats have to sort of thread two needles, right? If they go the impeachment route, they also have to put forward a policy position, right? It's not enough just to impeach,
right,
because I think a lot of Americans want to see some sort of substantive policy. But going back to something you said, Jeff, with this possible collusion, will this even matter to, say, 30% of the American public? Will they even care if the president possibly colluded with an adversary?
Since the moment he was elected, right, winning an election with a minority of the popular vote, and with only about 80 or 90% of those who voted for him saying they approved of him, right? Trump has never sought to do what most presidents do, which is build upon that to become more popular, to pass legislation. What he's done is focused on red meat to that 35% to keep him loyal, because that's what keeps him, in plain English, not only from being impeached, but from being put in jail. And as long as that 35%, and that could be 30%, the numbers are rough, believes that whatever Mueller finds is fake news, that's Trump's goal. And you started this program by reading off a list. And because of time constraints, you didn't include everyone on that list because we only have half an hour or so for this program. But yet, the theme that Trump keeps saying is that they've found nothing. And if any of you spent too much time on Twitter, as I have in the past, the Trump people are constantly saying, this is all a smoke and mirrors. They've found nothing. Of course, they found a lot, but they believe they found nothing. His goal is keep those 35% believing that if Mueller finds a video of Donald Trump saying in broken Russian to Mr. Putin, I will do anything you want once I get elected, they will still believe that's fake news. Right. That's his goal.
Yeah, and I think that's why you're right. That's why those attacks on the media, repeated attacks, have been so important. And I think how quickly Mueller's report actually comes out is also important. Democrats are going to have a strong fight to release portions of it that they believe are really damning to the United States very quickly. And then again, once that comes out, the question is, how does the president respond to this? If they have really clear evidence that he colluded with Russia, what does he say to these supporters? I know they're the diehards there, but I have to believe there's a portion of those people that are not going to be pleased if the president of the United States has been disloyal in any way to the country.
No, really, because I really wonder if the horse has already left the barn, right? Because he has set up the frame that the media, people like you, are the enemy, right? Because you're the elite New York Times.
Enemy of the people.
And so, if these things are true, where does his base go? These are people who still think that the caravan is coming to Minnesota to take over their lake houses and, eminent domain. The framing that's been set up has been so consistent and intense. What's polling been showing?
Right. I think the elephant in the room here is we have a national presidential election in 22 months. Which is, I think, hard for a lot of us to believe.
It's happening, Matt.
But that's right, and that's the reality, is you can't win a national presidential vote with 35% of the American people. You just can't. And I think the challenge, to the point that was made earlier exactly, is that Trump has not done anything to grow that base since 2016, which is a problem for him. And it's something that he has to do to be able to win in 22 months. And so I think that's one piece of it. And I think the other piece, which actually benefits Democrats, is that the House can proceed on some of these investigations, potentially at some point on impeachment, and the national presidential contenders on the Democratic side can be holding that policy conversation with voters in Iowa and in New Hampshire. And so we can do both at the same time. We can be having a national conversation about issues that matter while the House is working on, investigative matters.
Well, I want to follow up with you on that, because I've always said Democrats need to learn how to walk and chew gum at the same time. But two questions for you. One, because this has gone on for so long, and we know Americans have a relatively short attention span, right? Mm-hmm. Has it gone on possibly too long? And so will voters get tired of hearing about it? And two, where do Republican senators play a role in this? Trump only has 30 to 35% of his base, but we've seen his Republican senators, the Mitch McConnells, the Lindsey Grahams, because of their fear of being primaried, have been sycophants in many ways. They have not spoken up. So,
and I think that the challenge they'll face in 2020 is the challenge they faced in 2018, which is this: it is impossible to be a Republican leader today in the House or the Senate and both agree and hold water and carry water for Donald Trump and appeal to a majority of voters in this country. And so that's, to the success of Democrats in 2018, what happened is Republicans are facing this problem now where they both have to advocate on behalf of an unpopular president and also appeal to 51% of voters. That didn't happen in 2018. It's hard to imagine how that changes between now and 2020.
I think you're all a little more optimistic than I am. You mentioned that the 2020 election is the elephant in the room. If that's true, the mammoth in the room is that Donald Trump, the woolly mammoth in the room, is that Donald Trump, and I've written a piece about this with my colleague Jerry Goldfetter of the Daily News, is preparing to not leave office if he loses a close election. You will hear more noise about illegal voting as this election approaches. This Republican talking point, which you now hear on the far left, that, hey, Trump is a strong candidate. Trump is a very weak candidate. in 2020. His reelect has never really got, his popularity has never gotten about 42%. You don't win in that situation, but that story's out there. If this is a close election, he's not going to tweet out, congratulations, Senator so-and-so, I look forward to a peaceful transition, this is what makes America great. He's going to say, do not believe CNN fake news. And within 36 hours, the Republican leadership's going to get behind that. And the reason is because, I use a different word, but they're co-conspirators here.
Oh.
Everybody,
Yes.
This is the one thing about the Mueller report to keep in mind is that while it will color in the lines and fill in the details, the basic knowledge of what happened has been out there in the political class for 2 years, and in the rest of the country for slightly less than 2 years. Everyone knows that Trump worked with Russia in one capacity or another, his campaign, to win that election. Some people have built a fence around that in their mind and are denying that, and others are aware of it but know that the truth can't come out. There's not going to be any revelation. There already is the smoking gun. The smoking gun was out there by January of 2017.
Right. And so we're also pretending, that there aren't other elections that Russia can meddle with because
Because that's what they do.
that's what they do, and that's what they've been planning to do for a long
Anybody
time.
had been, I mean, where was the bipartisan committee, the bipartisan commission, the bipartisan legislation to make sure this never happened again? That alone, you asked for the smoking gun, that's a smoking gun. They want, so we're
This
not,
is where the
2020
senators
we're
are.
not going to elect ourselves out of this crisis of American democracy quite as easily as many think.
Right. So I think it's time for us to brush up on, some foreign governments and how they've negotiated that. So, Jeff, I want to bring you in, and let's bring it a little bit closer to home with our new Attorney General, Tish James. Attorney General James has been very clear that she's going to go after Trump and the family and the foundation and the entities and the organizations. How do you think she's going to be able to move the needle in this New York State context?
Well, I think she remains an important backstop, of course. And first, there's been some initial criticism of her for kind of being a little too public with how she's going to go after Trump, and whether that would damage her in a court of law, whether Trump has already tried with the charities case to try to say that Eric Schneiderman, former Attorney General Eric Schneiderman, had a political agenda against him. So, since she's taken office, she's kind of toned down some of that Trump rhetoric, which leads me to believe that she may be back in the office actually, putting together these cases. I know that she is interested in following up on the charities case. She's also interested in looking into the emoluments case. So there, it just seems like there's a lot going on with the president, not only from Washington, but you have a lot of the state attorney generals, the Democratic state attorney generals have now banded together and are now tackling a lot of these issues. So he's in jeopardy from very different angles.
Multi-pronged approach. I mean,
Yeah,
does that make him a wild animal in a corner, or how does that play out?
Bringing it back home into New York, not only the Attorney General's office, but obviously the Southern District of New York, and an ongoing investigation into criminal campaign finance violations that's still ongoing, even though Michael Cohen's been charged and is going to jail, and he'll be testifying in front of the House in the next week or two.
And P.S., we keep saying jail. He's going to prison.
Correct.
Which is a difference.
There is
a difference.
Yes.
Fair. And so that investigation is ongoing as well, and one would surmise, because that investigation is ongoing, that there are other co-conspirators as part of that, and I think we have an obvious understanding of who one of them might be. And so there's a lot here, and I think the challenge for Democrats is that because so much is going on, there needs to be a public conversation, largely driven by Democrats, threading the needle between all of this. Because otherwise, I think what we saw in 2016 is it's overwhelming, and voters don't know what to focus on. There has to be a consistent narrative here, which I think is one, corruption, and just abject corruption. And so I think the way they thread that needle is overlaying that conversation with their legislative agenda. I think it's why the House has pushed H.R. 1 to sort of put out there that Democrats have an anti-corruption piece of legislation. And that, I think, effectively starts the conversation into, okay, what's happening on the other side?
There are other states' attorneys general as well. This is important because what that means is that if Trump ever leaves the presidency, even if he resigns and is pardoned by President Mike Pence, hypothetically, he still faces the prospect of a lifetime of legal hassles and eventually imprisonment. And what that means is that there's no easy way out. There's no way to ease him out. Even Republican leaders who realize they're better off with anyone else, they can't do this because he knows. And you can't ask an attorney general who's a Democrat in the state of New York to not go after him. People want that here. There's a demand for that. No Democrat, Tish James is going to only help her political career by going after Donald Trump. So you can't ask her not to do it. But that makes this even more complicated when we think of moving Trump out of this position.
I think the stars are aligned here too, right? Because Tish is in favor of pushing a law that would allow her to prosecute anyone that the president pardons, and also in Albany now, all the House and the Senate,
Unified government.
is controlled by Democrats. So there's a chance that that sort of legislation could actually go through, which would actually give her the strength, the power to even be bolder in going after the president on some of these issues.
Well, I think what's so dangerous, which all of you have alluded to and spoken very clearly about, is that the frame, though, has been anything the Democrats say is sort of hypothetical and, it's fake, and he's the only truth. And so I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the wall. The wall that Mexico will pay for, the wall that will be a big wall, it'll be a beautiful wall, it'll be a grand wall. So I'll start with you, Matt. How does the president get himself out of this bind? Nancy Pelosi has very clearly said, you're not getting the money, right? You said Mexico was going to pay for it. It's ridiculous. It's feasibly, anyone who's ever seen a map knows that, topography says it can't actually happen. So she's doubled down and said, no, we've had some performance, we've had some slamming on tables, we've had some storming out. How does the president get out of this situation? Because he was elected as besides possible Russian collusion, but he was elected as a deal maker. I know how to go in a room and sort of get you to change your mind, and I get money for it, and everything always works out in my favor. And now we're seeing it on the national scene. This deal maker might not be who we
said he was.
maybe we can edit this out.
I think the challenge for them is what they see as a win versus what is actually a win. And so it seems obvious at this point that they are proceeding forward with this idea that the president can declare a national emergency.
And they is?
The administration.
Okay.
Yeah. And get his money. That will obviously be tied up in court for years. They'll never get the money through that. But the Trump administration seems ready to declare that a win and say that they got the win they need. I think the problem there is twofold. One, it's a politically horrible idea. It's an unpopular idea from an unpopular president on an unpopular issue during an unpopular shutdown. So not great politically. I think the other issue for them is this opens up a huge can of worms for Democrats in the future to say, healthcare is a national emergency. Gun violence in this country is a national emergency. Climate change is a national emergency. So we're going to use the presidency when we get it to suddenly declare that there is money here to combat these things that we think are national emergencies. It's just a problem here that I don't see Republicans in the long term being satisfied with.
What do you all think?
Trump has backed himself into a rather odd corner here, because pounding his fist on the table and saying, I want a wall, helps him politically. The worst thing that would happen for Trump is that he actually got the wall, right? It would be a waste of money. It would not solve any problems. He would have to bargain away something that Republicans, who actually do have conservative positions about immigration and about undocumented immigration and things like that, would be giving away something and getting nothing because the wall is useless. And by the way, when the hammer meets the nail, so to speak, who's actually going to build that wall? It's going to be undocumented workers from Mexico, right? Because the Republican contracting companies that through the inside deals are going to get these, they don't hire union workers. They're going to go with the lowest workers. Imagine that story. So the last thing Trump needs is this wall. He's backed himself into a corner. I think Matt's laid out a scenario that may be the only way out for Trump. And it's a matter of, do you want to lose badly or lose terribly for the president?
You have 800,000 federal workers who are not being paid. You have farmers in Iowa who, have tried to stand by the president, but now they're being hurt by the fact that the government is shut down and they're not getting their subsidies. So this is not good for him. The very people that he needs to keep in his corner are the people that are being hurt by this federal government shutdown. So the longer this goes on, the worse his bargaining position is.
Let me just ask this question. So years ago, LBJ, my favorite president, said, if you can convince the poorest white man that he's greater than the Negro, you can pick his pockets all day long. Is this the 21st century version of Trump still trying to convince his base, and granted they're not all poor, but that they're better than these immigrants who are taking their jobs or whatever the boogeyman is, and he's been able to make policy that has actually consistently hurt his base? So how does he does he even get hurt by this in the long run? Because he can brag that he has the longest shutdown ever, right? Because that's secretly what he wants to talk about. I mean, where does his base go? Because they haven't left when he's talked about Mexicans, Muslims, blacks, Jewish people. I mean, the list goes on. We only have 30 minutes. Like, we can't even list the name of the people that he's insulted. So his base hasn't left yet.
I might ask
will they even leave with this when it hurts their own pocketbook?
Rephrase that a little bit, which is that let's say that the scenario that you've laid out is what happens. So everyone goes back to work, paychecks are gotten. Some people do miss mortgage payments, and that's a real hassle. That's a real problem for people. Other people can't pay for groceries for a couple of weeks. Those are real problems.
And we want to make sure people know this isn't just people who are employed by the government. These are all the people who are around. The restaurants where government employees aren't coming in to eat.
Contractors who aren't going to get back pay.
Yeah. All of the
right?
things.
But
babysitters, you name it.
What I always say about Trump, whenever one of these news items comes up, is that one thing I'm pretty confident of is we won't be talking about it in 3 weeks. Right? So will the base leave him? No, because in 3 weeks he'll be using racial slurs against football players, just for example, or something similar. He'll find something else. He'll find some pop culture figure with whom to pick a fight. He'll be talking about something else. We will all be talking about something else. The one thing that Trump has been extraordinarily good at is setting agendas. We talk about what Donald Trump wants us to talk about. And if we settle this shutdown tomorrow, 3 weeks from now, he's not going to want us talking about this, and we won't be. So when you run on a white supremacist platform and you give your white supremacist base fodder for that worldview, yeah, they're going to stay with you. They've cut this deal. The racism is more important than the economic, moving forward economically. We know that about Trump's voters. Now, and some of these are affluent people for whom the racism, they can live with the racism if they get lower taxes. And I know these are unpopular things to say, but it's largely not in this crowd. But it's true. So yeah, I don't think it's going to hurt him among them.
No, and look, we don't need to talk about this in some sort of esoteric way anymore, because we had 2018. We had an election in which the president ran towards his base, talked about immigration, talked about these crazy, violent stories of immigrants killing white people, and they lost a historic margin in the House. That is not a winning majority strategy in this country. So if he wants to focus on that 35%, all the more to him. It's not a winning strategy heading into 2020, and we know that for a fact based on what happened in 2018.
Even with the Electoral College, even with some major losses statewide?
It is not, and you're absolutely right about that. And if he were going at this as, I need to win a free and fair election, he'd be very, very foolish. But I think he's going at this as, I need that when I say the election is false, there is enough support among Republicans and there is enough fear, and my base gets agitated enough that I can stay in office.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a certain percentage of his base that has really made a decision that regardless of what happens to them financially or whatever, that this sort of xenophobia, racism is what they want to see in this country. And, you know, he has that base. He's going to continue to play to that base. I mean, if you looked at his speech on television the other night, most of the statements were false or misleading about, you know, how drugs come into this country. Most of the drugs are not
lies, but I know you work for the Times. The Times is always like, you know, that's a misleading statement. I'm like, it's a bold-faced lie. How about that?
Well, the drugs are not coming in through the desert. They're coming in through, you know, regular ports of entry. So again, the problem is whether people can process all of that. You know, this is a lot coming at people at once. You have Russia, you know, what's happening with the government. And so I think people just need to take a look at, you know, what's happening, how is it affecting them. And I think he's in more jeopardy than you believe to be.
So
I think
his presidency has been a crash course in civics for a lot of Americans, right? Because there's been an onslaught of so many different issues, local, state, and nationally, and somehow he's wrapped up in it. So we can talk about, unfortunately, Donald Trump for far too long, for way too long, which he loves, which frustrates me.
Too long already.
Exactly. His 15 minutes of fame has somehow lasted 40 years. But in these last 5 minutes, I want to talk about something closer to home. I want your thoughts on Mayor Bill de Blasio's State of the City speech. In it, he outlined a progressive vision for New York City over the next 4 years. But was it progressive enough? So, Jeff, I'm going to start with you and our dear mayor.
Well, you know, look, I think this speech compared to the last two was much more energetic. He actually had some new ideas in here. It was, you know, he received a lot of criticism for these last two speeches where, you know, they were just kind of big picture, you know, big thought. Yeah. So he actually unveiled some new ideas in this speech, one being the paid time off requirement, the other being the extending the health care for undocumented low-income New Yorkers. So I think he has to get credit for that. You know, a lot of people felt like he was much more energetic. It's clear that he's trying to reinsert himself back into this national debate. He clearly sees himself as a national leader on these progressive issues. We have a bunch of new progressives in Albany and Washington. So the mayor could be kind of positioning himself as a person who could set the agenda for these sort of people. Now, how successful it will be is unclear, because once you start looking at some of these proposals, such as the healthcare proposal, it becomes clear that it's not as huge as he has said in some statements.
Matt, did you hear anything new or interesting?
Yeah, I mean, as a progressive myself, I'm asking myself where this Bill de Blasio's been for the last 4 or 5 years. I think the challenge I see in this is it was a visionary speech. It clearly sets out an agenda that progressives have been looking for a long time out of the city. I think the challenge is he's planning on going on a road trip. He's planning on taking this message nationally to, you know, he's been a fan of Iowa, been a fan of New Hampshire. And so I think the challenge is who's implementing this policy. And we have, you know, a mayoral election coming up in a few years. I think we're going to have a lot of credible candidates who can actually take this mantle and run with it. I don't see how this gets passed if Bill de Blasio is taking his message nationally.
Lincoln?
A couple of thoughts. It does seem that Bill de Blasio kind of went about this backwards, in that these proposals, if they'd been in year one, now you get into the second term and you can talk nationally about what you've accomplished, right? So that's one piece. I think he got that a little bit backwards. But I also think that it's easy to overlook some of the accomplishments because of how much the world has changed. When Bill de Blasio ran in 2013, the first time, Michael Bloomberg was leaving office. Michael Bloomberg's signature approach was suing, you know, taking to the Supreme Court his right to harass African-American Latino young people, right? Mm-hmm. Bill de Blasio, in his speech yesterday, not about the things he would do, but talked about how not only has crime gone down, but the number of arrests have gone down. And that's the kind of thing that, frankly, if you're a middle-aged, you know, white dude like I am, you could shrug off. But if you're a younger person of color, that's a huge deal. 100,000 plus fewer arrests, that's a massively big deal for real New Yorkers. And he did that while, not he single-handedly, and he gave the police department, a lot of people can take credit for that. But today that's not considered radical anymore. Right. In 2013, that would be considered a radical approach to crime fighting. So the timing has changed here. And in regards to this timing, if you were, I don't know, the Colorado State, you know, Democratic Committee or something like that, you're organizing a dinner, what New York politician do you want to come and give your talk if you want to sell tickets? Now, Bill de Blasio, it's not about him, but he's no longer that politician. Right. That's the new congresswoman from Queens.
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Yes, of course.
And it's younger people, and it's more energetic.
And not just in New York, but
right.
everywhere.
Everyone.
So he's, if I were, I mean, I think de Blasio's legacy could be being a very good progressive mayor. It's not going to be being a national figure.
Right, so we'll see. Time will tell. He's got a new teleprompter, and so we'll see how the implementation phase works, which is real, right? Because we're still talking about fair fares. I agree with you completely. He's done a lot. But with these new ideas, how will they actually get done when we know that his bags are packed and he's ready to go? Yeah. So that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for watching this special edition of Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Goodbye.